question, how do we engage as Christians in a world as polarized as we are, be faithful to the truth on the one hand, and yet on the other hand, keep the door open missionally for how we engage with people, because people who disagree with us are not the enemy, they're actually the goal in terms of thinking about sharing the gospel with people. So it wasn't long after doing the first talk on 6 texts, and I'll just remind you real quickly what those texts are. The Ephesians 6, which says our battle is not against flesh and blood, but it's a spiritual battle. 1 Peter 3, 15 and 16 that says we're always to be prepared to give a defense for the hope that is in us, yet always do so with meekness and respect, with gentleness and respect might be another way you might translate that. And the second part of the passage says we do it because God was gracious to us. And when our back was turned to God, He was gracious to us. That's how we should treat others who are not connected to the living God. And we're not supposed to never forget where we came from. The third text is Colossians 4, 5, and 6 that talks about our speech always being seasoned with salt and always being gracious. The next text is Galatians 6:10, which says, therefore do good to all people, especially to those of the faith. Makes the point we're supposed to treat all people basically the same way. It's the application of the discussion of the law of loving your neighbor in Galatians 5 and 6. The next text is 2 Corinthians chapter 5, which emphasizes the fact we're supposed to be ambassadors for God and that we invite people, we plead with people to be reconciled with God. That's our message. We're supposed to be faithful. And then the last text is 2 Timothy 2, 22 to 26, which makes the point that we're not supposed to be engaged in controversy, but we're supposed to teach with gentleness and we're supposed to teach with patience. And then it's God's business to change the heart. Our job is to be faithful in how we lay out what the gospel is about. So those are the 6 texts that kind of framed cultural engagement. Well, it wasn't long after thinking about this that I figured we're in a contentious space. We're in a polarized space. The person that I sit next to, even in church, and I may not agree on certain things about what the application of the Christian faith is, much less the person who doesn't even go to church. So this raised the question about how to think about how we talk. And so today's talk is on how to have difficult conversations, or let's talk about how we talk. That's how I want to. But this is not a normal evangelical message in the sense that most evangelical messages, you go to church and you hear about 25, 30 minutes, depending on how long the pastor goes for, of the passage, and then the application kind of gets tacked on at the end. This is going to be the exact reverse. I'm going to spend maybe 5 minutes on the passage, and then everything else is going to be application. So we're flipping the script today. Here is the verse for the day. It's James 1, 19 and 20. It says, understand this, my dear brothers and sisters, let every person be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to anger, for human anger does not accomplish God's righteousness. It's actually not a difficult verse. It's very, very clear. It's very, very straightforward, and it puts the emphasis on being a good listener. To function in the world where there's so much disagreement, being a good listener is actually a very important skill. So that's where it starts. Now, I like to joke with people that the world has a version of this verse. It goes like this. Understand this, my dear brothers and sisters, let every person be slow to listen, quick to speak, and quick to anger, for human anger allows you to know what I'm really thinking. Okay? It's the exact reverse. If you think about the dynamic that's going on around us in public, it's the exact reverse of this verse, of the James 1 verse. And so that's important. Well, why is this important? This is a new slide. This is new to this talk. This time I'm going to have to explain it to you because it's confusing. But I'm going to talk in a little bit about lenses. Lenses are how each person is the lenses through which they look and see and forms the way each person sees the world. Okay? I'm going to define lenses for you. Lenses cause me to focus on certain things on the one hand, but the flip side of it is that means I'm not focused on other things because of what I'm focused on. That's the way lenses work. Lenses draw me to see the world through a particular framing and prism, if you will, and it also means I'm not seeing the world in a framing or prism that matches it. So that's how this diagram sort of works. Think about each spot on that slide as representing a person's different social location. They're where they are in the world, their background, their experience, etc. And the fact is, in case you haven't discovered this, we're not all clones of one another. We do not all occupy the same social space. We come from different places and spaces. Some of us are Texans, some of us are from California, another from Florida, some are from a different country. Some people live in one part of the world, some people live in another part of the world. Then there's the whole thing about some of us are male and some of us are female, some of us come out of a different racial background, etc. We all have different social locations that have framed us and have been our experience of life. So each one of these dots represents a location. Now, I didn't actually get a slide that could do what I really wanted it to do, but this is as close as I can get. So you'll see that with the dot, there's a direction of perspective that comes off each dot that you're seeing. Some of them are aligned with one another, some of them are aligned in a different direction. So when I'm engaging with people in the world, I'm engaging with people who have a different social location, and their lenses work out of the space like this, but this person's located here, this person's located over here, this person's located over here, etc. And we got to figure out how to live together. So lenses and social location are a part of this conversation, and you go into this space with a recognition that I occupy a certain location, I'm oriented in a certain way, but the person sitting next to me doesn't share the exact same social location that I have. That's important in setting up what I'm going to be talking about. So I hope that worked. Hopefully it did. Now, I'm going to introduce a word to you, and I'm going to take you back to Sesame Street. Okay? There's a word for the day today, and the word for today is triphonics. I'm sure you use it in your vocabulary all the time. It's a common word that you use all the time. What triphonics means is it's basically tri-level sounding. It's 3 channels broadcasting at the same time and interacting with each other. Every important conversation that we are engaged in operates on a 3-channel wavelength. All 3 things are happening at the same time, and they're interacting with each other. And so when we think about this, there's the topic that I'm talking about, whatever it is. There's the lens that we use to see that topic. And then there's the way my identity and interests are tied into what it is that we're talking about. All 3 of those are interacting with each other. And what drives most important conversations is not actually the topic that I'm talking about, but the other 2 channels. So what I'm saying to you is that when you think you're talking about a topic, there actually is going on in you and in the other person 2 other channels that are broadcasting at the same time that are how each person is reacting to what's being talked about. And some of them involve lenses, and some of them involve identity and interests. And they're all interacting with each other. And the more people you have, the more complicated it becomes. So here's what I mean by the lens. I've already talked about lenses. I've already said it causes you to focus on certain things. It causes you not to be focused on other things. It's the way lenses work. Okay? How do I illustrate lenses? This is easy. Okay? And as soon as I do this, everybody laughs. CNN and Fox. Okay? Think about how CNN and Fox work in the world. Okay? Everyone has access potentially to all the same stuff that's out there, right? CNN and Fox have access to the same stuff that's out there. They put on their lenses, they look at what's out there, they report on what's out there. You listen to the report and you wonder, do these 2 groups live on the same planet? Okay? That's what lenses do. Okay? I'm focused on certain things on the one hand, and I'm not focused on other things as a result. And in that picking and choosing, And in that prioritization, you get a different mapping of what's going on around you. Okay, that's how lenses work. Interest and identity operate in an even more subtle way. And the only way I know how to illustrate this is to tell a story. And the story that I'm going to tell is that I was born with a gift. That gift was multitasking. Okay? I was born with a gift. I can concentrate on multiple things at the same time. Now, psychologists tell you can't really do that, but I have the gift. Okay? So I think I can do it. And I can do it to a degree. It used to drive my mother crazy. You heard that I was a sports fan. When I was growing up, I used to listen to multiple sporting events in my room at the same time, which meant I had the television and or radio or whatever combination going, and I might be listening to 2 or 3 games at once, and my room would sometimes be a little loud. This drove my mother crazy. She would come into the room and say, "There's no way you can be following all that. It's noisy. Turn that down." And then I faced what I like to call the hour of decision. I could prove to her I had the gift. Okay? I could prove to her that I knew what was going on in each of the 3 games I was listening to. And I will tell you that when I adopted that strategy, it didn't go well for me. Okay? All right? All right? But I had the gift. I could do it. I could tell. I can follow what's going on in all 3 games. I know what's going on here because I have the gift. Years later, my wife married the gift. And now the issue was not sporting events, it's the computer screen. And I'm watching the computer screen and she walks in and talks to me. And she's talking to me and I'm concentrating on what's on the screen and I'm also trying to listen to her. And because I have the gift, I can look at the screen and I can hear the sound waves that are penetrating one ear, passing through my brain and probably going right out the other ear. But they did make a stop and they did register. Okay? All right? And in the midst of that, she will say to me, "You're not listening to me." Now, once again, it's the hour of decision. Once again, I can tell you, if I prove to her that I have the gift, it's not going well for me. All right? So, but here's what's going on in the conversation, and this is the point that I'm trying to make. When she says you're not listening to me, and when I hear you're not listening to me, I am processing that at the identity level, and she is processing that at the identity level in 2 very different ways. Okay? I'm hearing I'm not a good husband. Okay? If I'm not a good husband, guess what my instinct is going to be? I'm going to defend the quality of my husbandship. Okay? I'm going to defend the idea that I'm a good husband. At least that's going to be my default, is to run there. What she's saying to me is something else. What she's saying to me is, I don't matter to you enough for you to give me your undivided attention. That's really what she's saying when she says I'm not listening. It's not about listening, it's about something far more profound at the relational level. She's technically correct when she makes that point. And so what I'm saying to you is, the way in which conversations work is, there's something going on at the identity level, and there's something going on with the lenses that we wear that are really the drivers in most important conversations, with the topic only being, if I can put it, the frosting on the cake. That's important to understand about the way conversations work. A little aside here. This is supposed to be about theology and theological discussions, but I just helped you with your marriage. Okay? So you can package that however you want. I was going to begin today by saying lady and gentlemen, okay? Because we've got an imbalance in the room that I have noticed. Okay. So.
I've only got one elbow in the room.
Oh, it's early. So here's the question. When I'm engaged in a challenging conversation, which is what these difficult conversations are, how am I reacting to the conversation and how am I positioning myself? I tell people that this talk in particular, but a lot of what I'm talking about when I talk about cultural engagement, is designed to be what I call a meta conversation. I'm not discussing where you are in a particular place on a particular issue. That's not the concern. The concern that I have is, how do I walk into any of those conversations? What's my orientation no matter what I may be talking about? as I walk into something that I know is inherently going to be a challenging situation because I know I'm not coming from the same place that the person I'm talking with is coming from. So it raises this question. What kind of listener are you? That's the question that we're raising. What kind of listener are you? And there really are only basically two categories. You are either what I call a rebutter, debater, or you are a listener. Okay? Now you can flip back and forth. That's possible to do. All right? In which case you're schizophrenic, just confess it.
Or you have the gift.
Or you have the gift. That's right. That's right. You're now operating on quadraphonic sound, okay? All right. You've gone from triphonics to quadraphonics. But anyway, so you're either a rebutter or debater, and it's real easy to tell which you are in any given moment. You hear something that hits your theological tilt meter is what I call it, okay? Your doctrinal meter, okay? And it goes, ah. Okay, you didn't hear that, but that's your tilt meter going off. That's your doctrinal meter going off. And in that moment, you have a choice. The choice that you have is, I'm going to form my rebuttal. I'm going to respond to this person with what they need, what I think they need to hear, and I'm going to engage them in a debate. Okay, that's what that's going to do. Or I can choose to ask questions, actually trying to find out where the other person is coming from and why. I call this getting a spiritual GPS reading on someone. I'm trying to figure out, before I have my conversation and move to assessment, I'm actually trying to understand what the nature of our conversation is and where it's coming from. And so when I do that, all I have to do is ask questions probing for why someone thinks the way that they do, what resources are they drawing on to think that, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's actually a great way to help people who are nervous about difficult conversations, because they will sometimes go into a difficult conversation and say, let's say I'm meeting someone who has a different religious belief than I do or something like that, and they go, you know, I don't know anything about Buddhism. I don't know anything about Confucianism. I don't know anything about being a Muslim or whatever. Just go through whatever the list is. And so they feel like they can't engage because I really don't understand where that person's coming from. Well, this is a difficult concept. Guess how easy it is to figure out where the other person is coming from? Just ask a few questions and let them talk. And so you engage with them and you're trying to get a spiritual GPS reading on them. And what you're trying to figure out is what their values are, what's going on at the lens and identity levels that actually get you into the level that's driving the conversation. And you're also looking for potential bridges where they may have a value that you also have, but they're applying it perhaps in a different way, which opens up the door for a different kind of conversation. In fact, what it does is you've set yourself up to have a conversation rather than a debate. So I tell people what you need to do when you're in a difficult conversation is to put your doctrinal meter on mute. Okay, you aren't going to turn it off, it's going to go off. And there will be a time to move from trying to understand your conversation with the person you're engaged with to assessing it. But you don't want to leap to assessment before you actually understand what the nature of your conversation is actually about. And a lot of times we move to assessment before we've actually determined what this conversation with this individual is all about. Why do we do that? Because we stereotype people. We say, well, if you hold this, this must be everything else that you hold, which may or may not be true. And I don't know that until I engage them and actually engage in getting a spiritual GPS reading on where this person actually is, that kind of thing. So that's raising the question of, how do I become a listener? How do I become quick to hear and slow to speak? Now, shifting gears. When we engage in these conversations, there are certain things that we do that undercut these conversations hardly before we ever get started. And I'm going to show you 5 things that sabotage our conversations. They happen around us all the time. They are being demonstrated to us 24/7. They are the defaults that is working in most conversations that undercut conversations and make it hard for us to have good conversations with people we disagree with. Here's the list. Now there's a red light on that slide, okay? The red light means stop, think, try not to do these things, okay? But here's the list. I'm going to go through them one at a time. They're the quick confession and pivot, what I'm going to call demonization, or when I'm in a really good mood, the exorcism. Okay? Mode of assignment, the idea of never surrendering or doubling down, and tribalism. Okay, those are the 5 categories that I'm going to talk about. I'm going to go through them one at a time. Quick confession or pivot is something I was taught by public relations people, because I do a lot of speaking and a lot of engagement with media and get questions in public space. And I actually was taught by a very good PR person how to do this. Here's the premise of the pivot and the premise of the quick confession. It is someone raises something that's actually, in your soul, a little bit problematic for the view that you hold. Okay? It's not what you want to be talking about when you're in public space. So how do you get the person off of what they want to talk about in public space that puts a little pressure on you to the thing that you want to talk about that puts a little pressure on them? Okay? That's basically what the pivot, and there are actually several ways to do this. I'm being generous with the term quick confession. Quick confession says, I acknowledge that, and then the next word that you use is the word but. Okay? That's the pivot. Okay? This is sometimes called whataboutism. Okay? Someone raises something and you go, well, what about this? Okay? You're trying to pivot the conversation. You're trying to get it off a platform that might be a little bit uncomfortable for you to the platform that is more comfortable for the view that you hold. Okay? And you're trying to control the space. That's what a pivot is designed to do, and it's done with a pivot. Now, today, in some situations, people don't even bother to confess. Okay? They just go quick to the whataboutism, and they go to the other space that they want to talk about. You don't have to think about this, because if you watch most interviews of politicians who are being put under pressure by a question that they're being asked, they resort to this on a regular basis. This is a staple of how to interact in public space if you're a public figure. In some cases, the person asks a question and you get an answer and you're sitting there going, what does that answer have to do with the question that was asked? Okay? And sometimes it's N-O-T-H-I-N-G. That's how that connects to me. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. Okay? There's no connection. That's a pivot being applied to. Now let's think about this at the relational level. Someone raises something that's important to them to have the conversation about. They think it's a factor in the conversation. And you have pivoted on them, okay? You've Euro-stepped them, okay? All right, use a basketball term, all right? What does that say to the person who's raised the question about the space? What does that say about what they've raised? It's dismissive. It's disrespectful. Okay? Even if what you raise is a part of the conversation and is true, it still is a way of saying what you bring up isn't worth discussing. What I want to bring up is worth discussing. Okay? That's sabotager number 1. Okay? All right, it's going to be a lot of shrapnel. Number 2 is demonization, what I call the exorcism. This is debate by label. We never see this in the public square. Okay? All right? All right? Virtually every political commercial, we're in a political season right now, virtually every political commercial that you see is managed through labeling, what I call demonization, because you can see it in a political ad. Not only do you get the label, but you get the photograph. Okay? You know what I'm talking about? The photograph that says, I wouldn't want to be that person. Okay? They look like that. Okay? That's demonization. I also call it the exorcist, because the point of I label you and then I'm doing this. I'm burying you with the label. The label is designed to say, in effect, what you think doesn't matter. It's coming from a wrong place. That's the way labeling works. And it's a form of demonization. It's a form of dismissal. And it also is usually used as a way of not getting into substance. Okay? If I can label you, I can cut off having a conversation about the nature of our differences. Okay? It's a shorthand way of being dismissive. And it's an equal opportunity employer. One of the things that I say about these talks that I give is, I am not talking about the left or the right. I'm talking about the left and the right and sometimes the in-between. Okay? We all do this to each other, but for different reasons. And so this is how this works. C, conservative. L, liberal. S, socialist. C, communist. F, fundamentalist. E, evangelical. And the new one, woke. All right? We use terms, and the terms are designed to alter the conversation and to, in effect, shorthand it, which takes us out of the conversation of substance if we're not careful. That's the second one, demonization. Third is what I call the prophetic gift, motive assignment. Okay? Here's how this one works. Someone says something to you and they say, I know why you said this to me. Okay? And then you attribute a motive to it. Usually the motive is not the most appealing reason for stating what's been stated. Okay? And so you put a motive in front of somebody, it's motive assignment. I call this the prophetic gift because it better be right. Because if it's wrong, guess what you've just done? You've slandered the person. So, motive assignment, that's attributing a motive, which again, the reason I attribute a negative motive to what it is that you say is a way of being dismissive of what it is that you're raising, whatever it might be. Okay, next one is never, 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 that was emphatic, surrender. Okay, don't give up any ground. You can't have a conversation with someone who's on the other side that might even possibly suggest that something that they're raising might actually be a part of this conversation and worth considering. So you never surrender any ground. You double down. And we have walked away from considering whether it's possible that in our public space conversations, there may be a way to have maybe not exact same understandings, but some pursuit of some common element that we can pursue and share together in public space so we can live with our differences. Now, sometimes there are real disagreements, okay? But the idea behind this is what I call the raw binary. The raw binary, which is where our polarization puts us. The raw binary says, I have this 100% right, and guess what? That means you have this 100% wrong. It's saying, there's nothing of merit in the differences that we have that's worth discussing. That's the problem with never surrendering. That never surrendering is a reflection of that raw binary. There's nothing I can learn in the engagement with another person. The last one is just raw tribalism. Raw tribalism manifests itself when I find myself defending things that 10 years ago or 15 years ago I wasn't defending. Simply because of who it is that's taking the position. That's evidence of tribalism. I've got to defend my tribe no matter what. I can't indicate that my tribe ever does anything wrong. Okay? That shows weakness. That shows compromise. I'm not going there. When each side digs in on a tribal basis, guess what kind of conversation you have? That silence that you're hearing is the kind of conversation that you have. Okay, there is no conversation. Okay, those are 5 things that sabotage conversations. Let's do 7 things that can help conversations. This is green lighting. Okay, these are things that open up the door for a conversation. First, be vulnerable. Own your own stuff. Okay? This means when someone raises something in relationship to the view that you take that has some element to contribute to the conversation, that's acknowledged and it's pursued. Okay? Many of these are just going to be the opposite of what the sabotagers are. Be curious with open ears. If lenses are such, well, let me say it this way. I want anyone in this room who thinks they are omniscient to please raise their hand. I'm not seeing any hands, okay? There are no gods in the room. That's good, all right? This is what fuels this one, being curious with open ear. It's the willingness to listen and to consider whether something that's being raised is worth considering. Okay? It's the opposite of being dismissive. You want to stick to the issues. You want to avoid personal attacks. That's obvious. All of this is a reflection of being humble. Let me talk about why it's important to be a listener and asking questions about where the other person is versus a debater. The reason is when it's their turn and they're speaking and you're asking them questions and you're taking the time to get to hear where they're coming from, you're communicating respect to that person. If this is a real conversation, it's going to be your turn. You hope that by handling them the way you've interacted with them, that they will handle you the way you have handled them. If that happens, you get your turn by setting the tone of what the conversation is going to be about. Now, fifth one, this is important to me because everything that I've said could be read this way. You need to sublimate your convictions. You need to not speak up for what you believe in. Okay? That is not what I am saying. Okay? I'm saying is that there are times when you're going to express your convictions. There are times when you need to speak up and talk about what you believe, etc. But you want to be respectfully honest as you do that. So I'm not talking about sublimating what you believe or what your convictions are, but I am saying sometimes we need to think about not only what we believe, but how we communicate it. There's a how and a what. And the what can be as important as the how in having a conversation with someone I am disagreeing with. Sixth category is calling parsing issues. This is a complicated concept, and there are two elements to it. The first is to recognize how complicated some discussions actually are, how multi-layered they are. My illustration for this is going to be the discussion that rotates around Israel and the Middle East. When I speak on Israel and the Middle East, when I think about using this illustration, I wish yesterday hadn't happened, okay? But it has, okay? But here's Israel. When I get asked about Israel and the Middle East, and I'm doing Q&A, I divide up the stage into units. And someone will ask me a question, and I'll say, this is this topic on this conversation, and here's what's problematic about it. Here's what's debated about it. Okay? I get asked the second question. I walk to a different part of the stage. This is the second issue that this area deals with, and here's the debate that exists here. I get asked a third question. I go to the third space, and I go, here's a third area, and by the time I've gone to about a half dozen to maybe 10 different areas, depending on the questions that are being asked. What I'm trying to show is the issue has layers, okay? And not all layers work the same way, and not all layers favor the same group. Okay? That's what makes it complex. And so you work through these layers, and they're all present, and they're all interacting with one another. We do not like complicated issues, but some issues, in fact, are pretty complicated. So that's one way to think about parsing. Parsing is the ability to recognize I've got multiple layers that I'm dealing with here, and really to understand the area, I've got to have some understanding of each of these areas. And I also may need to understand and have the judgment to recognize that this area may work to the benefit of one group, but this other area may not. And to have some sense of being able to be discerning about that. The other area of parsing issues is what I call understanding the nature of the judgments that you make about any of those areas. Okay, so let me explain how this works. And this illustration works in seminary because we have a thing called the critical apparatus in a New Testament. And for those of you who aren't theologians and don't know about textual criticism, I have to explain the background before I give the illustration. But I'll try and see. In the New Testament, there are occasionally what we call variant readings. In other words, readings of the Greek that are different than the Greek that's in your Bible or the Greek that reflects your English translation. Your English translation sometimes reflect this by the or that's sometimes in the margin that tells you a different reading at this point. It's based on a different reading of what's in the Greek text. And there are myriads of those examples, but there are a few that are really important that show up in your Bible. Well, text critics have a way of weighing the judgments that they make about these differences, and they weigh it on a scale that goes A, B, C, and D. Okay? It's a way of the text critics signaling how difficult the problem is, the particular problem. A is, we're very certain about this text. We'd argue with God about it. Okay? We're that certain about it. B is, we know there's a debate, but we're pretty sure we're right here. C is, if we get to heaven and I find out you're right, I won't be surprised. And D is, let's be honest and flip a coin, neither of us knows. Okay? So that's the spectrum running from certainty to uncertainty about the particular problems that you have. And so one of the ways to think about these spaces and these layers and doing parsing of issues is to have some sense of how certain am I about this particular argument related to this particular topic versus what may be up for grabs for discussion. It's moving in that kind of a direction. And each piece gets some sense of how tenaciously do I hold to this, or how aware am I that there could be a legitimate discussion here. Okay? That's part of parsing the issues. Parsing the issues sometimes helps you understand how tenaciously should I hold to the point that I'm trying to make here. Because it may be related to the judgment call that I'm making about what it is that's being discussed. Last but not least, what helps a conversation is if I am hunting for some kind of a shared value or gospel opening in the life's choices and issues of location that are raised in the conversation. Illustration. We take students every year to Sundance, the Sundance Film Festival. You might ask, what are seminary students doing at Sundance? I guarantee you, had we done it a century ago, church leaders certainly would have asked that question because you weren't supposed to be going to movies at all. But the reason we do it is because we take our students and we're trying to turn them into having the ability to listen. And what they're supposed to listen to is, this is because Sundance is really good in its documentary space, where it's dealing with issues of the challenges of what people face in living. And what you're seeing are people who may or may not have a faith. In many cases, they don't have a faith. But they're dealing with the same human problem that someone in the church might face. And the question is, how are they tackling this? How are they viewing it, etc.? It turns us into listeners because in some cases, they are able to see things, articulate things, and present things that are a part of the conversation that's worth listening to because of the nature of their experience, the way they've spent time, etc. And so we work hard to try and teach people to say, where are their values coming up that may be applied in a way that I don't agree with, but the value that's triggered is shared. Okay? I just apply it in a different way. So rather than saying to the person, you've got this totally wrong, I say, you know what, I share that value, but this is how I apply it. It's a different way of having a conversation and walking into the space of a difference. And you're also looking for bridges that lead into the gospel. This leads immediately into the next slide, which is called 3 types of issues. Now, I think I've mentioned this to you before, but this is where this fits. Okay? There are 3 types of issues in the public square, best I can tell. There are what I call genuine worldview clash issues, where the starting points are so different and so challenging that you're inevitably talking past one another because what you have prioritized in your lenses are so different as starting points. Okay? The 2 issues I think fit most neatly into this category are abortion and the discussions on sexuality and gender. The starting places are so different. In the abortion discussion, it's the definition of when life begins, which is what Christians tend to be concerned about, versus the issue of freedom of choice and conscience that a person who says, the government shouldn't be telling me what to do with my body. Okay? Just a very different starting point. Okay? And so, two ships passing in the night. Worldview clashes. Worldview clashes are the apocalyptic level of disagreement. Okay? When you're operating in what I call category 1, that's DEFCON 1. Okay? You're basically saying you're in such different places that the likelihood of finding common ground is very, very slim. There's very, very little to have a conversation about. So that ends up being a contentious space. That's the point. The second is shared goal, different path. Shared goal, different path. What is that? Okay, the category I put here, and it's a contentious category, but it's an interesting one because it's different than category 1, is racial reconciliation. If I say to most people on the street, should the races be reconciled to one another as a goal, as an aspiration? Most people are going to go, yes, that's a worthy goal to pursue. We should be pursuing whatever we can to have the races be reconciled to one another. Those numbers would be so high, most politicians would say, man, I'd love those approval numbers. I wish I had that approval number. You ask the second question, how do we do it? Now you're in your difficult conversation. But at least you know you're aspiring to the same goal. Okay? That makes it different than category 1. Okay? Even though there's a lot of dispute that happens in that second layered question in category 2, you're at least knowing that you're sharing a goal and you've got a different path to get there. That's category 2. Category 3, and this is my premise, is where most political issues fall. Category 3 works like this. We live in a fallen world, and that means things are dysfunctional. Because things are dysfunctional, that means there can be virtues that aren't aligned, they collide. Why? Because it's a fallen world. Things are out of whack. Okay? When things are out of whack, they're not calibrated properly in relationship to each other. And so I have two sets of values that are colliding, or maybe it's 3 on 2 or 4 on 3, whatever it might be. But there are these values that are colliding because I live in a fallen world. What happens in our political space? Each group, okay, maybe even a political party, picks the value they hang their flag on, and then they work hard to neutralize or minimize the value that collides with it. Okay? And so they lift one value up and they work to try and minimize the other value that's a part of the conversation. And when we do that, we never have the conversation we need to have. Conversation that we need to have is, how do we bring these values, each of which has merit, into better alignment with each other? Okay? We never have that conversation in public space because each side has decided which value it's going to plant its flag on and work accordingly. I would suggest to you that most of our political issues fall into that category, and that each side is defending a value that if we step back and looked at that value in its raw terms, we would go, you know what? I have sympathy for what that value represents. Okay? Again, I might apply it differently. That might become part of the conversation. But at least what it opens up the conversation to say is, and to change it, is to say, you know what? You're raising something that is a part of this conversation, but let's think about how to balance that with this other thing over here that we also have to cope with. All right, that's the 3 types of issues. I'm almost done. In fact, I am very, very close to being done. Here are the principles that I've just taken you through. 1, we need to learn to recognize that we all make judgments about what to prioritize. That's the way our lenses work. Okay? And that in many cases, core identity concerns drive the judgments that motivate our choices. Our choices may well, in fact, we may deeply believe that our choices are rooted in identity and connections to things we regard as true, and the alternative is regarded as false. That's certainly part of what's going on. Of course, the conversation exists because the other person thinks the same thing about the way they put the package together. So that's the challenge of the conversation, if you will. Second, listening helps us see what is driving someone else and therefore makes for better conversation. If I really understand where the other person is coming from and why, I'm in a better position actually to assess that conversation than if I have to guess about it, or if I'm positing what's motivating them. Last, it builds trust and respect. It changes the dynamic of the conversation, the way in which it works. It opens up the possibility for having a conversation, and as a result, it tends to improve the quality of the conversation when you stop and actually take the time to try and understand where someone else is coming from and why, even though you may not agree with what it is that they're telling you. Okay? I'm skipping the next slide because that's going to be a separate talk, but I'm going to give you a preview. The next thing that I'm going to do with you the next time I come in April is we're going to go back to the future. We're going to look at the first century church, and we're going to ask the question, how did the first century church operate in this space? They were in an environment that was not, can I say this, did not appreciate Christianity. Can I say that? Okay. They had no social power. They had no cultural power. They had no political power. All they had was spiritual power. So how did they do it? And they seem to have done it pretty well. So how did they do it? Besides the 6 texts that I've already mentioned, I'm going to bring up a handful of examples to think about how they went into this space and how they interacted, and what we might be able to learn by going back to the first century to understand how to engage in the future. That's what's coming. So here's what I've said to you so far in the multiple trips that I'm making. I've now logged 1,500 miles coming and going. I've made 3 trips to Houston in the last however many months we've been doing this. Okay, and this is where we are in terms of understanding cultural intelligence. Cultural intelligence requires understanding the mission correctly, that people are the goal, and that tone matters. They are not the enemy. Ephesians 6 says our battle's not against flesh and blood, it's against spiritual forces. The trick is Satan works incognito. You don't even know that the people you're interacting with in many cases don't even know that he's there or don't believe that he's there. It's one thing to try and rescue someone who knows they're in trouble. It's another thing to try and rescue someone who has no clue they're in trouble. That's the challenge of public space. Secondly, cultural intelligence requires we do a better job of listening. That's what I've tried to say today. Third, it requires a different way to see people we disagree with, because we have the opportunity to imitate the way God treated us when our back was turned to God. So how do we extend the same kind of graciousness and initiative in relationship to someone whose back is turned to God that God showed us when our back was turned to Him? It requires learning to understand where people are coming from and looking for common ground connections. But we may be engaging in the pursuit of a fresh application as we look for those points of commonality. They may be applying something in a way that I may want to challenge, but at the same time, I may want to acknowledge that the desire and the value that they're trying to pursue is worth pursuing. Okay, that's different than simply saying you're wrong. Next, it requires working to put a rock in the shoe of folks, understanding the value of a lived out faith. I'm saying 2 things here. The rock in the shoe is raising questions or pursuing a direction that gives the person that I'm interacting with pause about where they are. You know, the rock in the shoe is the thing that irritates you. I think I talked about this to you before. You get a rock in your shoe and you shake your shoe, right? And then you hope that God blessed you with a big enough arch that the rock can be in the ice of the arch and your arch isn't too small. It's big enough to absorb the rock. Or you might take it to the front of the shoe or to the back of the shoe so that when you walk, you're not walking on the rock. That's the goal, until you can take your shoe off and get the rock out of your shoe. But the point is, you know that rock is there as long as it's in your shoe. So the point is, you're trying to, this is from Greg Kunkel in a book called Tactics. You're trying to give people at certain points a pause for what's going on. That's a rock in your shoe. You're also trying to live out your faith with such consistency that it gets attention. This is what I call the Hamilton principle of the Christian walk. And I'm thinking about the Broadway play Hamilton. There's a certain point in the Broadway play where Aaron Burr is meeting Alexander Hamilton for the first time. And there's a little song that goes, talk less, smile more. Okay? Don't go on with the wording because it doesn't apply. Okay? Because don't let people know what you're looking for. That part doesn't apply. But talk less, smile more. I think the church needs to think through talk less, show more. Our faith should be lived out in such a way that the distinctiveness of how we live stands out and draws attention. If you listen to the testimony of many people who come to faith who did not grow up in a Christian home, somewhere in that testimony is a section that goes like this. I met this person or participated in this group. They were different. Something about them was different and it made me curious. And that's the start of the journey. Okay? That's the show more part. That's the catching what you see, the way this community is functioning, that draws attention to the fact that God is doing something different with this group of people than I normally see in the world. When we act like the world does, we turn ourselves into a special interest group. And there are many special interest groups to choose from. Thank you very much. Next. Requires understanding the gospel as central, which means we cannot make, and nor is our calling, to make the world into the church. And we should not try. Here's what I'm saying here. The church exists for a reason. It is a separate entity in the midst of the world for a reason. When we make politics more important than what's happening in the church, we actually are undercutting our testimony of the fact that the church is supposed to be a different entity on earth, that where the real difference lies, if we're not careful. The world is going to be with us, breaking news. The world is going to be with us until God fixes it. The way of the world is going to be with us until God fixes us. We are supposed to live in contrast to that, and we're inviting people into a community that allows that to take place. The laws that I pass that may reflect divine direction, okay, they have a value, but they have a limited value. Because the real value is the changed heart. We've been through the experiment where God was present, God had a people, and God had laws functioning on behalf of those people. That section of the Bible is called the Old Testament. And how did that go? Okay? That's why we got a new covenant. We got a new covenant because without a changed heart, the real change doesn't happen. This is why you have to stay missional on this stuff. Okay? We are to contend in public space for what makes for a flourishing life. That's what we're called to do. Okay? We're to do that. But we're also recognizing that we're not trying to win a debate, but gain a soul. While also understanding that when we're fighting in the world, we may sometimes have to lose well. Which is what Jesus did when he went to the cross. How can we lose well? Last, all this can be done because we have nothing to fear, and victory we know comes one day. A secure identity in Christ means we can engage, resting in our heavenly citizenship as paramount, and decisive for trusting in faith and resting in God. And then we really need to believe this verse. Greater is he who is in us than he who is in the world. I actually sometimes think when I'm listening to the way the church is afraid of what's going on in the world, that they don't actually believe that verse. And with that, I am perhaps painfully done.